Welcome everyone on site and online for another event organized by the Lise Meitner Group, China and the Global System of Science at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin and the Berlin Contemporary China Network. Today we have a guest lecture by Daniel Murphy of Harvard University on the geopolitics around China's scientific rise. It is a very topical topic, of course, but I'll say a few words about Daniel's background so you understand better also where he comes from. Daniel Murphy is Executive Director of the Mossavar Rahmani Center for Business and Government at the Harvard Kennedy School. We're very happy he made this long way from Harvard here, also given the travel restrictions yesterday across Europe, which also allows us to have some in-depth, intimate conversation about potential collaboration and much else. He did his graduate studies of politics at the Johns Hopkins University Nanjing University Center for Chinese and American Studies. He also holds an MA in Chinese Studies from the University of Massachusetts Amherst and a BA in English and Chinese Language and Literature from Connecticut College. Before joining Harvard, Dan served for nearly 5 years as Executive Director of the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies at the Harvard China Fund, which together are world-leading research centers for the study of China. Dan also served as the inaugural Program Director for Yale Center Beijing. From 2008 until 2014, he was at the National Committee on US-China Relations, finishing as Director of Special Initiative. In this role, among other things, he grew the Public Intellectuals Program, which connects America's next generation of leading scholars with policymakers and the media. Daniel Murphy is still a member of the National Committee on US-China Relations, and he serves on the advisory board of SubChina. So you can see his position in the past and also currently are very much about networking and facilitating academic exchange between the US and China, but he recently also published a very interesting study, Stumbling Bear, Soaring Dragon, Russia, China, and the Geopolitics of Global Science, together with Joe Johnson, Jonathan Adams, and Jonathan Grant. The study is amazing, in my view, not only because it has a richness of data. You can see China's rise in the sciences very much visualized. It's scientometric and bibliometric data, but also it compares the cases of Russia and China, because nowadays we are very much focused always exclusively on this very particular case of China. But through putting it together with Russia, I think there's really some added values for analysis, not only because you can study how politics and science come together in other autocracies, but also there might even be potential alliances of autocratic scientific players in the world. We've also seen how, in the case of Russia, the Russian war against the Ukraine has triggered responsive red lines, and these discussions about the Russian case do also impact how we talk about our scientific relations to China today. So a lot to talk about. His talk today is, as you can see in the title, very much focusing on the Chinese case, but I think we will come back to these macro questions in the discussion at the latest. I'll hand over to Daniel Murphy now, and I'm very much excited and looking forward to what he has to say. And I'll instruct everyone on how we deal with the Q&A in this very hybrid mode after his talk. Thank you. Welcome, Daniel.
Thanks so much for that introduction. And thanks to Professor Anna Allers and everyone at the Max Planck Institute for a really warm welcome. It's a great honor to be here and get a chance to share some of my work and hopefully learn from all of you as well. I present this work in the spirit of collaboration and in the spirit of learning better about this topic. So the presentation is called Dancing with Dragons: How Should Institutes of Higher Education Engage with China? And I came to this topic because I am an administrator in higher education, and it's because of what I saw happening around me. So when I was at the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies, I had a visiting scholar from China who came to someone on my team and said, I got a phone call from someone who said they were from the FBI who wanted to have a conversation with me. What should I do about this? I sort of think it might be a scam. I've heard people being tricked in this way, and I'm not really sure how to react. This was somebody from the PRC who worked in social sciences. And the question ended up coming to me, and I thought, gosh, I don't know. I've never gotten a phone call like that before, and I don't know if it's perhaps a scam or something else. So what we ended up doing is, after trying to figure out this question, we ended up going to the Harvard University Police Department, which got in touch with their local contacts in the FBI office. And lo and behold, this person actually was from the FBI. I should add, as part of the story, that before we had gotten back to this visiting scholar, this person got another call saying, I'm at your house, or I'm near your house, and I'd like to stop by for a visit. Are you available? And it was stories like these that got me thinking, because I felt that, this person had applied to us to be a visiting scholar. I had read her application materials, so I'd seen her CV and things. And of course, she was granted a visa by the US diplomatic mission in China. So from what I could see, the materials that I had, it was not a particularly sensitive situation. But obviously others in the US government thought differently, and all I really had to go on was what this person was talking to me about. And I felt it was my responsibility to create an environment that was conducive to research and teaching for this person. And it felt to me like what was happening, again, I only talked to the visiting scholar, not to others, that that there was some element of this that was needlessly harsh, or perhaps needlessly intimidating. So I started to work. Let's see here. How do I advance the slide here? There we go. So I started to work on this issue really in sort of a constellation of activities, which included writing, speaking, and work with colleagues internal to the university. So in terms of my recent writing, Anna mentioned a co-authored piece with Jonathan Adams, Jonathan Grant, and Joe Johnson comparing Russia and China. I subsequently co-authored a book chapter with our Vice Provost for International Affairs, Mark Elliott, and I referenced that work in this paper. I wrote an opinion piece called "We Mostly Have Nothing to Fear," and there's one other piece there. But also, I've also been doing some speaking on this topic and trying to work with colleagues internal to the university to understand how to react to these issues. So that's sort of the constellation of activities that I've been undertaking to try and explore this topic and my motivation for the work. And really, the work is based on the interaction of three trends. The first of these trends is hardening geopolitics. I think this is the one people are probably most familiar with. So this is due to Russia's invasion of Ukraine and China's reaction to it. We are probably all familiar with China and Russia referring to the relationship as one without limits in the lead up to the invasion, and continued close collaboration between those two countries. It's also about the era of the US-China relationship based on engagement, which has been consistent since the 1970s, coming under question, and in the minds of some, coming to an end. It's about concerns about Chinese influence operations in Europe, in Australia, in New Zealand, in the United States, and beyond. Concerns about Taiwan, Western concerns about the nature of Chinese governance in human rights, and least we not forget, of course, also deep Chinese misgivings that perhaps the West, and specifically the United States, seeks to contain or otherwise keep China down. And I want to pause here for a moment and just say that in this presentation, I focus very closely on the United States, partly because that's the context, the higher education context I'm familiar with. But part of my visit here is to try to better understand how these issues interact with what's happening in Germany and in Europe. So the first trend, hardening geopolitics. At the same time, we see the increased importance of science, technology, and innovation to the economy and to military power. We see repeatedly how the United States is concerned about Chinese advances in technology, particularly with regards to semiconductors and AI, artificial intelligence. And just to bring up one data point here, for the recent Chips and Science Act, if you look at the fact sheet that came out of the White House, the title of that fact sheet, or the first line, is White House Chips and Science Act will lower costs, create jobs, strengthen supply chains, and counter China. Similarly, I was actually recently reading the 2019 document on EU-China relations called the Strategic Outlook. It lists China as an economic competitor in pursuit of technological leadership. And if we look at Chinese views on this issue, we could pick out many, but just to choose one, the 20th Party report from Xi Jinping includes the word science 29 times. And if we read about in that document, China's overall development objectives for the year 2035, we read a lot about science. For example, one of the bullet points for 2035 is to significantly increase economic strength, scientific and technological capabilities, and composite national strength, so on and so forth. So we have hardening geopolitics. We have the increased importance of STI to the economy and military power. And we have these two trends coinciding with increased international academic engagement. So for example, in the United States, pre-pandemic, in the start of the 2019-20 academic year, there were 370,000 students from the PRC at US colleges and university. I looked up the number for Germany. There were 416,000 international students with about 40%, or I'm sorry, 40K, somewhere around 10% from China. And of course, as we'll see, as we get into the statistics here, academic collaboration in the sciences has expanded greatly in recent years. And we see, as we'll see from statistics later, the best science is global. I should point out that these three factors, hardening geopolitics, the importance of science, technology, and innovation to the economy and military power, and increased international engagement are interdependent, right? They react with one another. And I think that's one of the interesting parts of the work. Just to go briefly into the third trend, something that will be familiar to a lot of people here, but to go over it in short, increased international engagement in terms of the sciences. This was a framework that has been written about elsewhere, but also by my co-authors in the paper that Anna mentioned. But in the 1980s, we considered this the nascent phase of international academic collaboration. Most countries had as little as 5% of their original research papers published with a second country. The G7 group of large economies had about 60% of the papers indexed in the Web of Science. And prior to 1990, Chinese academic institutions were represented by less than 1% of those articles. We then had the advent of air travel, or more frequent air travel in the 80s and 90s, leading to greater bilateral collaboration. And in the 2000s, widespread use of the internet, leading to greater international collaboration, or multilateral collaboration. So when we get to the year 2020, these are what similar set of statistics show. So we can look at some of the countries here at their rate of international collaboration. This is based on statistics from the Web of Science. We have the UK leading the group with 65%, Germany at 56%, the United States at 40%, et cetera. And by 2020, the G7 group collectively produces less than half of the global research output, and China's output grew to 25%. So this is a narrative I think a lot of people here are familiar with, a huge expansion in international research collaboration and the growth of China as a global superpower, a global scientific superpower. Just again, on international academic collaboration, this shows a trend. I think interesting thing about this chart, this is from IAEA's Open Doors report. We can see the tremendous growth over the last 20 years of students from the United States or from China studying in the United States. And somewhat worryingly, the red line, US students studying in China. My understanding is that pre-pandemic, there were perhaps 10,000 or so American students on the ground in China. Today, that number is at about 300. So I'm quite worried about what that means for our future understanding of China. So why is this question of how we should engage with China important for institutions of higher education? It's important because of students. This was a surprising statistic to me, which I recently saw in a paper, that 17% of 2020 US doctoral degrees in science and engineering went to foreign students from China. It's important for the best science. We know from analyzing citations that the best science is global, and China is an important part of that. It's important because of our understanding of China. And what I would say about this is, in comparison with China, the United States, I think, is a relatively easy place to understand, in the sense that there's an open and free media. There are numerous non-government organizations and think tanks that are writing reports and reporting on a diversity of views, which is not the case in the same way in China. And I'm not delivering a value judgment on which system is better, but simply to say that when we have Chinese and students and scholars come to our universities, we gain an understanding of China that otherwise would be very difficult to obtain. And I think that, after all, whether we're interested in climate change, public health, the global economy, or any of a range of issues, understanding China better will help us in achieving our goals, and understanding it less will make it more difficult. So it's important because we're able to gain that insight, and students tell us that it's the diversity of the student bodies who they study with, which is a great part of what they value. And having students and scholars from China contributes to that. It's important because of economics. At $41 billion, higher education was America's third largest export industry in 2018-19. And I would argue that it's important because of our values. And I think the thing that has made our institutions of higher education great is academic freedom, the ability to have unbiased inquiry into any of a range of topics. And anytime we circumscribe the people with whom we can collaborate, or the topics on which we can collaborate, without well-founded evidence for why that should be the case, I think we need to be worried about the impact on academic freedom. Given this importance, I was concerned, looking at debates within the United States, on the excessive, in my view, focus on risks. You know, there's little in the United States that can bring together Republicans and Democrats right now, but it seems to me that the CCP has managed to do just that. So if we look at this quote from Secretary of State Mike Pompeo from the Trump administration, he says the Chinese Communist Party is poisoning the well of our higher education institutions for its own ends. We then have House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, leader of the Democrats, or a leader of the Democrats, saying there are those in Congress who believe, and I am among them, that we should be seeing what influence the Chinese have in terms of their undue influence at universities in our country. And I had a third quote there from FBI Director Christopher Wray, saying the FBI opens a new China-related counterintelligence case nearly every 10 hours, and will continue our aggressive efforts to counter China's criminal activity. And what I was seeing on the ground is how this had done damage to academic inquiry. Damage because Chinese academics have trouble getting visas. Numerous times I've spoken with Chinese scientists who are scheduled to be at a conference, or were scheduled to be at a conference, would apply for a visa and have the process delayed until they had to cancel their participation at the conference. The Fulbright program was canceled. For decades, the Fulbright program sent academics and students back and forth between China and the United States. Many of those Americans who went to China would come back to teach or do research on China in ways that inform the public and policymakers. And again, those Chinese Fulbright scholars and students who came to our universities, I think we gained a great deal from those interactions. That program was canceled. As we'll see with statistics in a moment, American academics are more wary of working with China. And sadly, for those who are in the United States or at other universities for teaching and research, Chinese academics feel less welcome than they did before. So if we look at some of the stats on this, this to me is a pretty disturbing set of statistics. This is the survey done by the University of Arizona, and committee of 100. And I think it's worthwhile to look closely at some of these numbers. So I'm going to go through it. For those who feel fear or anxiety of US government surveillance, scientists of Chinese descent, over half of them experience that, whereas those of non-Chinese descent, less than 12%. Feel racially profiled by the US government, 42.2% of scientists of Chinese descent, less than 10% for non-Chinese scientists. Feel they've had difficulty obtaining US research funding because of their race, nationality, or country of origin, 38% for those of Chinese descent and 14% for those of non-Chinese descent. And finally, feel they have had professional challenges because of their race, nationality, or country of origin, 37% versus 16%. And this data, I would say, reflects what I was seeing anecdotally on the ground, even before I was able to get ahead of these numbers. And least we think this is only one set of statistics from one report. We have another paper called Caught in the Crossfire, Fears of Chinese American Scientists, co-authored by several people, including my colleague at Harvard, Lin Shihong, and they surveyed 1,300 US-based scientists of Chinese origin and found 35% feel unwelcome in the United States, 72% do not feel safe as an academic researcher, 65% are worried about collaboration with China, and 86% perceive that it is harder to recruit top international students compared to 5 years ago. So when I was seeing these anecdotes expressing the concerns reflected here in the data, I was convinced that there was something that was not optimal and indeed wrong about US policy and about the environment in the US for engagement with higher education engagement with Chinese colleagues, both those of Chinese descent and those from the PRC. And just for a moment, it can be easy to abstract these issues into statistics and charts, but I do think it's worthwhile mentioning one specific case so we can think a little bit about the personal ramifications this has on individuals. This is Professor Chun Gong. Professor Chun studies heat transfer at MIT. He immigrated to the United States to become a citizen in the year 2000. In January 2021, over 10 federal agents came to his house at 6:30 a.m. He was handcuffed and his wife and daughter were awoken by the FBI. Of course, he was accused, by the way, of concealing affiliations to China and applications for funding. And of course, this had major ramifications for his life and for his academic research and his lab, to pretty devastating consequences. After a year, he was exonerated and all charges were dropped. And of course, this is a tragic event for Professor Chun, Professor Chun Gong, but it also has had deep reverberations, I think, within the scientific community in the United States, and particularly for researchers of Chinese descent, that this type of thing could happen. So I think that the statistics that I've just shown, we have to ask ourselves, what benefits have these actions produced? I'm not always sure of the exact benefits, which I think is one of the problems I grapple with. So given the statistics that I've just shown of Chinese scientists feeling unwelcome, feeling like they're racially profiled in disproportionately high ways to those of non-Chinese descent, I think that's particularly concerning when we look at US international articles co-authored with colleagues from China. As is so often the case when you look at these charts, China is the green line, zooming up ahead of all of the others. You can see the dramatic increase following this green line from collaborations in 1996 all the way up to 2020, exceeding 25%. We have the United Kingdom in yellow, which has stayed fairly steady. Japan, which has seen a gentle decline. South Korea, which has seen some increase, and India, which is on an uptick. But given these co-authored articles, and I guess it should be noted that when we talk to scientists who engage in this type of collaboration, of course, they do it because they're seeking out research partners who can help them produce the best scholarly work. So often American scientists or those at American universities are choosing to collaborate with colleagues from China. And this tells us that those collaborations are producing some of the best science. So one of the things Anna mentioned in her introduction is the paper that I co-authored with several colleagues comparing Russia and China in terms of their scientific collaboration. So if we look at Russia, a country that has recently been excluded from many scientific and other networks, we can see that Russia, this is from data in the Web of Science, was 16th in the world for research output, accounting for less than 3% of leading publications. And as my co-authors pointed out in our recent paper, this is a far cry from the USSR's historic position as the world's 5th most prolific publisher. Russia's researcher workforce has fallen by 20% since 2000, and half of its international collaboration is limited to astronomy and to nuclear and particle physics. Even if we look at investment in R&D as a percent of GDP, for Russia, it is barely 1%. And today, all of the countries in Central and Eastern Europe, Russia is the leader or most frequent collaborator, only with Belarus. And even there, China is already second and likely to displace Russia soon if events continue. So one of the things we point out in our paper is severely circumscribing or excluding Russia from international scientific collaboration is one thing, but if we look at China by comparison, disentanglement will not be so easy. And we should note there is a strain of thought in the United States that we should decouple or disengage from China, but it is also difficult for China to disengage from the West and the US specifically, should they wish to do so. Part of this is because of China's deep integration into global academic science. So China is now the world's biggest spender on research and development. It is the first or second most frequent research partner for the G7, the Scandinavian and Baltic states, Australia, Singapore, and South Korea. And interestingly to me, one thing I learned through this paper is growing research links with places like Iran, where it's the second most frequent collaborator, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. So this means that disengaging from China and global science will have high costs, both for the United States and others who may wish to pursue that mode. One of the statistics we had in our paper shows collaboration shares as an average for the 5-year window from 2016 to 2020, and each country's total output for 2018 is shown in the white dot on this chart. So, and I'm sure that if we look at China, we can see on the left-hand side, over 60%, quite a high number. And if we scan over to Russia, we can see the much lower level of articles produced. This really illustrates the story that we were just telling. Interestingly, on this chart, the topmost light blue column shows multilateral collaboration. And I'm intrigued that China apparently has such a small proportion. Looks to me like a curiously small proportion of multilateral collaboration. And I haven't figured out if that's significant, and if so, why. So I'd be interested to hear if others in this room maybe have thoughts on that. But you can see here the difference between the high output from China and the relatively low output from Russia. So really my work, I was talking to Anna earlier, and my work is to try to get people to kind of think harder about the ways that we engage in global science, and to not take the topic in such a black and white manner. So my goal is to get us between two extremes. In the one extreme, we engage with science with, quote, friendly nations. I put this in quotes because we can all have different definitions of what friendly nations are. But this is a extreme where we become increasingly embroiled in sort of a global circling of the wagons, with nations prioritizing economic sovereignty over mutual interdependence, where we may blindly adopt needlessly risk-averse set of policies that cripple global science. And under this scenario, today's highly globalized networks of knowledge creation, which include researchers seeking to mitigate climate change and address public health issues, will wither as nations fall back on domestic priorities and on research undertaken in the narrow confines of their own institutions and with like-minded neighbors. At the other extreme, we have assisting the, quote, enemy, where we sleepwalk into engaging in scientific collaboration with countries whose interests are fundamentally inimical to our own. We naively provide scientific know-how, legitimacy, and to support to regimes that threaten the international system, engage in progressive human rights abuses, and more. And again, my goal here is to try and get us to go into a nuanced position that's at neither of these poles. And I think thinking in these two black and white terms is not the most productive way to consider this issue. So what I'd like to see, and I've seen, I think I've seen in the United States, I think there's been an over-dependence or an over-emphasis on risks. And I would like us to think about both risks and benefits, because getting it wrong, as I've shown through the data in this presentation, has huge consequences for science, for higher education, for students, and for individuals. And the benefits are great. We know that the best science is global, so getting it right will mean better science, it will mean better and more productive student bodies, and it will mean better visibility into China. And I think one thing we need to keep in mind in the United States is that this is not solely a bilateral issue. After all, students dissuaded from attending American universities or doing research in the United States will not necessarily return to China to engage in their studies or do their work. It's a global market. They will take their talents to other globally competitive institutions of higher education in Europe, in Australia, elsewhere in East Asia. So I work at the Harvard Kennedy School, and we do research and teaching, but we also try to inform policy. So my co-author, Mark Elliott, and I came up with 5 principles that we felt that institutions of higher education should adhere to when considering collaboration with China. The 5 principles are as follows. The first is academic freedom. And this is founded in the belief that we're strong because of our commitment to academic freedom. And so in all of our international engagements, we should consider whether they enhance or detract from academic freedom and academic inquiry. Within those bounds, we should strongly encourage international engagement. Collaboration. The increase in internationally co-authored articles, especially in the STEM fields, facilitates important academic discovery, and it should be encouraged. Support for students, faculty, and administrators. I think one thing I've discovered as an administrator and talking to my colleagues, talking to other students and faculty, is that it would be wrong to claim that engagement with China does not put new burdens on students, faculty, and administrators, despite the many benefits. Students may worry, as some have said to me, that what they say is reported back to Beijing. Faculty may legitimately worry that their academic work on sensitive topics may hinder their ability to get a visa or visit relatives in China. And administrators may worry about putting their institutions at risk. I think we need new partnerships at home. And this is a sensitive topic, but it's imperative, I think, that we maintain robust communications with the government and funding agencies in the present circumstances. And we should not forget that we also need partnerships abroad. After all, I don't think we can expect countries to stop gathering intelligence on one another, nor should we be naive as to the powerful role that the CCP plays at Chinese universities. But we also know from experience that these realities need not fully constrain the Chinese side in making choices that enhance openness and exchange, not least of all by certifying Chinese students as being abroad for genuine study and teaching. And so there are 2 specific actions that then we recommend, or we hope will happen. One is mapping I've seen lots of sort of piecemeal mapping of academic collaboration, particularly in the STEM fields. But what would be very helpful is more detailed mapping of each of the subfields within the scientific community and the academic collaborations within those subfields. And of course, we need to cultivate cultural expertise in order to get these questions right. Having people who have the language skills, the cultural acumen, the experience on the ground in China to engage in these issues in meaningful and nuanced ways is critical. I want to conclude by talking about a couple questions that keep me up at night on this topic and that I hope to learn more about through my own work and from learning from all of you. So I think the central question in my work is how, if at all, should national security concerns interact with higher education? Another question is, how do we measure, quote, Chinese science? For the data that we looked at from the Web of Science and most similar studies that I've seen, we look at the home institution of the co-author. That's what's provided for the article. But what about Chinese nationals at 9 Chinese universities? How do we think about students and scientists of Chinese descent, which some of the data that I showed begins to get at? So how do we think about Chinese science? A third question, I recently read a really good article on this by Emily Weinstein. What is the nature of the research undertaken at universities known as the Seven Sons of National Defense, which are directly under the supervision of the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology? We know some things about those universities, but I think we need to go deeper. I should note one of those universities is Harbin Institute of Technology, where I studied Chinese in 1999. I guess I'm connected to one of those and one of those Seven Sons of National Defense in some way. But I think we need more specific fact-driven work on what these universities do. I often read in the literature about China exploiting the open system of scientific exchange. I think we need to ask, to what extent does each country benefit from scientific engagement with China? After all, China isn't just exploiting the system, they're also contributing to it. And where is that balance in different fields? I mentioned this next question previously. Why does China have a comparatively small mix of multilateral collaboration? Is that significant? And if so, why? And the last question that keeps me up is, there has been theft of intellectual property in the commercial sector. I think this is relatively well documented, but much less in academia. I think people often elide over this fact. What does this mean for academic engagement? I want to leave it there and just say thank you all for your attention. I look forward to the interactions, both in the question answer period right after this and with some of the people I'm going to engage with informally afterwards. I think I have my email on the first slide, but if anybody wants to write me, it's Daniel_Murphy@hks.harvard.edu. Thank you so much.